Welcome to our deep dive, you guys, into the world of microeconomics. We're going to be going really deep on some of the big ideas.
Yeah, we want to get past just the definitions and stuff,
Mm.
kind of have those haha moments. We'll be using excerpts from a microeconomics textbook and some real world examples to help explain everything.
Right. And we're really going to try to connect it back to everyday life.
Yeah, you'll start to see the world through an economist's lens or whatever.
Exactly. So are you ready to dive in?
Yeah, let's do it. So Unit 1 of the textbook is called Introduction, Markets and Prices, which kind of lays the foundation. We'll be learning about how prices are determined and all that, and how markets react to changes in supply and demand.
Okay, cool. So let's say someone is thinking of launching a new product.
Right.
What are the key things they need to understand about how the market's going to react?
Well, the first thing is understanding how supply and demand work together. The book uses figure 2.3 to show this. So picture a graph with price on one axis and quantity on the other axis. The supply curve slopes upward. So that means as the price of something goes up, producers want to make more of it. The demand curve slopes downward. That means as the price goes up, consumers want to buy less of it.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Sellers want to sell more when the price is higher.
Right.
And buyers want to buy less when the price is higher.
Totally. So the spot where those two lines cross is the equilibrium.
Okay.
It's where the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded are equal. It's basically where buyers and sellers agree on a price and a quantity.
Okay, so the equilibrium point is the market price and how much is being sold. But what if something messes that up?
Yeah, so the book shows how shifts in supply or demand can change the equilibrium. Figure 2.4 shows what happens when the supply curve shifts. Let's say a new technology makes production cheaper.
Uh-huh.
That would make the supply curve shift to the right because at every price level, suppliers want to make more stuff.
So if there's more supply,
Yeah.
does the equilibrium price go down?
Exactly. And the quantity traded goes up. The book shows this visually with the equilibrium point moving down and to the right. And the same kind of logic applies to demand shifts too. Imagine people's incomes go up.
Okay.
They might want to buy more of at every price, shifting the demand curve to the right.
So then both the price and quantity would go up.
Yep. And these shifts in supply and demand happen all the time in the real world. It's kind of a constant back and forth between producers and consumers,
Yeah.
reacting to all sorts of things.
So our textbook has some cool examples of this.
Yeah.
They talk about copper prices.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. It shows how real-world events like recessions or supply problems can affect prices. Figure 2.21 shows how copper prices have changed over time. You can see how demand slowed down in the 1980s, partly because of a recession, and that made the price drop.
And were there those minor strikes too?
Oh, yeah. Those strikes in Peru and Canada really messed up supply. Less copper, supply curve shifts left, prices went up.
Wow. Yeah, so we can actually see those real-world events playing out on the supply and demand graph.
It's a really useful tool for understanding why prices change.
Definitely. Okay, so another interesting example is OPEC.
Right.
And how they affect oil prices.
Yeah, OPEC controls a lot of the world's oil supply, so they can kind of directly control the price by changing how much oil they produce.
Right, so when they limited oil production in the 1970s,
Yeah.
that caused huge problems.
Totally. Prices went way up. And that brings us to elasticity, which is the next thing the book talks about.
Okay, yeah, elasticity.
It basically measures how much the quantity changes when the price changes.
Right. I remember that being kind of tough to understand, all
Yeah.
those formulas and stuff.
It's all about percentages.
Yeah.
But the idea is actually pretty simple. If a small price increase causes a big drop in demand, we say demand is elastic. Luxury goods are a good example. People are really sensitive to price changes when it comes to stuff they don't really need.
Okay, and inelastic demand would be the opposite. The price changes a lot, but demand stays pretty much the same.
Yeah, exactly. Think about gas or medicine. People still need to drive and take their meds even if the price goes up, so demand for those things tends to be pretty inelastic.
Right, even if we complain about the price, we still got to fill up our tanks. And the oil example shows the difference between short-run and long-run elasticity too, right?
Totally. In the short run, after OPEC raised prices, demand for oil was pretty inelastic. People didn't immediately change their driving habits or buy more fuel-efficient cars. But over time, people did start to change their behavior and find other energy sources, so demand became more elastic.
So you got to look at both the short term and the long term to understand how markets react to price changes.
Yeah, it's a process, not just a one-time thing.
Right. Okay, so we've talked about supply and demand, elasticity, and how those play out in real markets. Now I'm curious about consumers.
Okay.
And what makes them tick?
Yeah, so Unit 2 is all about producers, consumers, and competitive markets, which focuses on consumer behavior.
Okay.
It tries to explain how people decide what to buy, like given their preferences and their budget and the prices of things.
Cool. Like trying to figure out why people make those weird buying decisions.
Well, not necessarily weird. Consumers are actually pretty strategic, even if they don't realize it. A textbook lays out a three-step process for understanding choices. First, it assumes people have preferences, like they rank different groups of goods based on what they need and want.
Okay, so like some people might want a car that's comfortable and safe, while others might care more about gas mileage or having the latest technology.
Right. And then the next thing is budget constraints. Everyone has limited money,
Oh, yeah,
which means you can't buy everything you want.
right. Limited resources.
Yeah. So, given their preferences and their budget, consumers choose the combination of goods and services that makes them the happiest, which economists call utility.
Okay, so it's a logical process even if we don't like write it all down and do the math.
Right. But the book does point out that this model makes some simplifying assumptions, like people aren't always perfectly rational.
Right, we're not robots.
Right. That's where behavioral economics comes in.
Okay.
It uses psychology to try to create more realistic models of how people make choices. But even with those extra details, the basic framework of preferences, budget constraints, and utility is still super useful for understanding consumer behavior.
Cool. So how does the book actually like model those choices? I remember seeing some graphs with like indifference curves and budget lines.
Oh, yeah, those are useful for visualizing consumer choices. Indifference curves, like the one in Figure 3.11, represent all the combinations of two goods that give someone the same level of satisfaction. They're kind of like those contour lines on a map,
Okay.
showing different levels of happiness.
So like if someone is equally happy with 2 scoops of ice cream and 1 slice of cake or 1 scoop of ice cream and 2 slices of cake, those 2 points would be on the same indifference curve.
Exactly. Now, budget lines, like in Figure 3.11, show all the possible combinations of those two goods that someone can afford given their income and the prices. It's like a fence showing what they can actually buy.
So consumers are trying to get to the highest indifference curve they can while staying within their budget line.
Exactly. It's like climbing a mountain, but you have to stay on the trail.
I love that analogy. It really helps to visualize those trade-offs people are making all the time.
Yeah. And sometimes the best choice is to only buy one of the two goods.
Okay?
That's called a corner solution, which is shown in Figure 3.15. Imagine someone who spends all their money on food because they really prioritize nutrition over other things.
Okay, so they're at the corner to their budget line, buying as much food as possible. Makes sense. So how does marginal utility fit into this?
Marginal utility is a big part of it.
Okay.
It's basically how much extra satisfaction you get from having one more of something.
Okay.
Like, think about eating pizza. That first slice is amazing.
Yeah.
The second slice is good, but not quite as good. By the time you get to the fifth slice, you're probably full, and that extra slice doesn't add much to your happiness.
The law of diminishing marginal utility. The more you have of something, the less you want more of it.
Exactly. That's why people don't just spend all their money on one thing.
Right.
They spread their spending around to maximize their total happiness. And the book talks about the equal marginal principle.
Okay, I vaguely remember that one. Remind me.
Basically, it says that people maximize their utility when they spend their money so that the marginal utility per dollar is the same for every good. So if the marginal utility per dollar for pizza is higher than for soda, you'd buy more pizza until those two things are equal.
So you want each dollar to give you the same amount of extra happiness no matter what you're buying.
Exactly. The textbook uses a car example to show how this works in real life. Example 3.3 talks about how car companies think about consumer preferences and budget constraints when they're designing new cars. They do a lot of market research to figure out what features people want and how much they're willing to pay.
That makes sense. They want to offer a variety of cars
Right.
at different prices to appeal to different people.
Totally. And this brings us to individual and market demand. The book explains how individual choices add up to the total demand for a product, which is that downward sloping demand curve we talked about earlier.
So it's like taking everyone's individual preferences and budgets and combining them to get the overall demand.
Yep. And this section introduces normal goods and inferior goods.
Okay, remind me what those are.
So normal goods are things that people buy more of as their income goes up, like going out to eat or taking vacations.
Okay.
Figure 4.3 shows what an inferior good is. That's something people buy less of as their income goes up.
So maybe, like, instead of taking the bus, someone buys a car when they get more money, so they stop buying bus tickets.
Exactly. Then there's the income and substitution effects of a price change, which are shown in Figure 4.6.
Okay, those always confuse me a bit.
Yeah.
Explain those again?
Let's say the price of coffee goes up. The substitution effect is pretty simple. People might start drinking more tea because it's now relatively cheaper than coffee.
Okay, so their demand for coffee goes down because they're substituting it with something else.
Right. Now, the income effect is a little trickier. Since coffee is more expensive, people have less money to spend overall. So they might buy less coffee just because their budget is tighter.
So the income effect is about how much your purchasing power changes when the price changes.
Exactly. It's like having a smaller budget. Then there's the idea of consumer surplus, shown in figure 4.14. It's basically how much benefit consumers get from buying something at a price lower than the maximum they'd be willing to pay.
So like if I'm willing to pay $5 for a latte, but I only have to pay $3 for a latte,
Yeah.
then I have a consumer surplus of $2.
Exactly. It's like a bonus or a measure of how good of a deal you got. Okay, one more thing before I finish Unit 2. Network externalities.
Network externalities, that's where the value of something changes depending on how many other people are using it.
Exactly. Like social media is a good example. The more people using a platform, the better it is for everyone. That's a positive network externality. But there are negative ones too, like traffic. The more cars on the road, the worse it is for everyone.
Yeah, for sure.
Figure 4.18 shows this with something called the snob effect.
So like sometimes popularity makes something better and sometimes it makes it worse.
Right. And network externalities make things more complicated because producers have to think about not just their product itself, but also how its value might change as more or fewer people use it.
Wow, this deep dive into consumer behavior has been super interesting. It's amazing how much goes into those buying decisions that we make every day. Okay, so now I want to learn about producers. Like, how do they decide how much to produce and what prices to charge?
That's a great question. That's exactly what we'll talk about next.
Cool.
All right, so now let's get into like the nitty-gritty of how businesses operate. Unit 3 is called production and cost.
Okay.
And it's all about like the factors that determine how much a company decides to produce and how their costs change as they increase or decrease production.
Cool. So we're like going behind the scenes to see how
Yeah.
businesses think about costs and benefits and all that.
Exactly. So let's start with the basics. Like, what do economists even mean when they say production?
Yeah, good question.
Basically, production is about transforming inputs into outputs.
Okay.
Inputs are things like raw materials, labor, capital equipment, that kind of stuff. And outputs are the goods and services that people buy.
Makes sense.
The textbook uses this concept called the production function to model this.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. It's like a way of showing the relationship between inputs and outputs, right?
Yeah, it's like a mathematical recipe for businesses.
I like that.
It shows how much output a company can make with different combinations of inputs. And one of the key ideas here is the marginal product of labor,
Okay.
which is like how much extra output you get from hiring one more worker.
So like how much does that extra employee actually contribute to the total output?
Right. But it's not always as simple as more workers equals more output.
Right, I was just thinking that.
There's this thing called the law of diminishing marginal returns,
Okay.
which is shown in figure 6.1. Think of it like this. If you keep adding cooks to a kitchen, eventually it gets too crowded. There's only so much space and equipment. Those extra cooks might not add as much to the total output because they're just getting in each other's way.
Yeah, that makes sense. So there are limits to how much you can produce, even with more resources.
Exactly. And companies also have to think about the trade-offs between different inputs. The textbook introduces this idea of isoquants, using table 6.4 as an example.
Isoquants.
Yeah, they're curves that show different combinations of inputs that can produce the same amount of output.
So it's kind of like those indifference curves we talked about earlier,
Yeah.
but for producers instead of consumers.
Exactly. Just like a consumer might be equally happy with different combinations of goods, a producer can achieve the same output level using different combinations of inputs. This gives them some flexibility if the prices of inputs change.
Right, so like if the price of one input suddenly goes way up, they could switch to using more of a different input.
Exactly. There's also this idea of the marginal rate of technical substitution,
Okay.
which basically measures how much of one input you can substitute for another while keeping output the same.
So like how much of input A do you have to give up to get one more unit of input B while still producing the same amount of stuff?
Exactly. The textbook also talks about two special cases: perfect substitutes and fixed proportions. Perfect substitutes are like different types of machinery that can be easily swapped out for each other. Their isoquants are straight lines, like in figure 6.7.
Okay.
Fixed proportions are when you have to use inputs in a specific ratio, no matter what the prices are.
So like maybe a certain chemical reaction requires a specific combination of ingredients and you can't just substitute one for another.
Exactly. Another key idea is returns to scale. This tells us what happens to output when we increase all inputs proportionally.
Okay, so like if we double all the ingredients in our recipe, what happens to the size of the cake?
Haha, I like that. Figure 6.10 shows the three possibilities: increasing, constant, or decreasing returns to scale. If doubling your inputs more than doubles your output, that's increasing returns to scale. This often happens in industries with big fixed costs, like manufacturing.
Oh, right, because as they produce more,
Yeah,
they can spread those fixed costs out over more units.
exactly. That's what people mean when they talk about economies of scale.
Okay.
If doubling inputs exactly doubles output, that's constant returns to scale. And if doubling inputs less than doubles output, that's decreasing returns to scale.
Okay, so even with more resources, there might be limitations on how much you can produce,
Right.
whether because of coordination issues or just like the physical limits of production.
Yeah, exactly. Understanding returns to scale helps companies make decisions about how big they want to be.
Cool. Okay, so we've covered production functions, diminishing returns, isoquants, and returns to scale. Now let's talk about costs. What are the important things to understand about production costs?
Costs are super important for any business.
Yeah, obviously.
And the first big distinction is between short-run and long-run costs.
Right, because in the short run, some things are fixed, but in the long run, everything can change.
Exactly. Think about that kitchen example again. In the short run, the size of the kitchen is fixed. The restaurant can hire more cooks, but they can't just magically make their kitchen bigger.
Okay, so their short-run costs will depend on those fixed things and how much they can adjust the things that are variable.
Right. So we have fixed costs like rent, which don't change with output, and variable costs like ingredients, which do change with output. Figure 7.1 shows how these different costs change as output increases.
So in the short run, businesses are kind of stuck with those fixed costs,
Yeah.
and they're trying to find the best way to manage their variable costs.
Exactly. Now, in the long run, everything is variable. The restaurant could decide to expand their kitchen or open a new location, so they have more flexibility in the long run to try to lower their average costs.
So long-run decisions are more about like big strategic changes,
Right.
while short-run decisions are more about day-to-day operation.
Exactly. And to analyze these long-run decisions, the textbook introduces isocost lines.
Isocost lines.
Yeah, they represent all the combinations of inputs that cost the same amount.
So like a budget line for producers.
Exactly. And companies try to find the combination of inputs that minimizes their costs for a given output level. Figure 7.3 shows this, where the isoquant, remember that's the curve showing different input combinations for the same output,
Yeah.
is tangent to the isocost line.
So that's where they're getting the most bang for their buck.
Exactly. And the book also talks about the relationship between long-run costs and output, introducing economies of scale and diseconomies of scale. Those are shown in figure 7.8. Economies of scale mean that as a business gets bigger, its average costs go down.
So they're becoming more efficient
Right.
because they can spread out their costs or get bulk discounts or whatever.
Exactly. And diseconomies of scale mean that as a business gets bigger, its average costs go up.
So it's like they get too big and things start to get less efficient.
Yeah, maybe because of coordination problems or communication breakdowns or just too much bureaucracy.
So it's like hitting diminishing returns, but for the whole company.
Exactly. Understanding all these cost dynamics is super important for companies when they're making decisions about their size and how fast they want to grow.
This has been really helpful. Now I'm curious to see how this all plays out in different market structures. Like how do these cost dynamics affect the decisions businesses make when they're facing different levels of competition?
Great question. That's exactly what we'll talk about in the next unit.
All right, so we've talked about consumers and producers.
Right.
Now I want to like zoom out and see how all this stuff plays out in different like types of markets.
Yeah, market structure is really important for understanding how businesses compete. Unit 4 is market structure and competitive strategy.
Okay.
It covers like the whole range of market types, from perfect competition to monopoly.
Okay, perfect competition. That was like the super idealized version
Right.
with tons of small firms selling the exact same product.
Yeah, it's like a textbook example. The book defines it as a market with lots of buyers and sellers, a homogeneous product,
Uh-huh.
and no barriers to entry or exit. Imagine like a farmer's market with a bunch of stalls, all selling the same type of apples.
Okay, yeah.
No single farmer can control the price. They're all price takers.
Right, so it's like super competitive.
Yeah.
And businesses don't really have any power to change the price. So how do they decide what to do?
Well, in perfect competition, companies try to make the most profit by choosing the output level where their marginal cost equals their marginal revenue.
Okay, quick reminder.
Yeah.
Marginal cost is the cost of making one more unit, and marginal revenue is the extra revenue you get from selling one more unit.
Exactly. And in perfect competition, since everyone is a price taker, their marginal revenue is just the market price. So they'll keep producing as long as making one more unit costs less than the price they can sell it for.
Makes sense. But what about in the long run? Like if companies are making good profits, wouldn't that make other businesses want to jump in?
Yeah, that's a good point, and that's exactly what happens in perfect competition. The book uses figures 8.13 and 8.14 to show this. As new firms enter, the supply curve shifts to the right, which pushes down the market price. This keeps happening until economic profits go down to zero.
Wait, zero profit? Does that mean the businesses are like going bankrupt?
Not necessarily. Economic profit includes both explicit costs like wages and rent and implicit costs, which is like the opportunity costs of the owner's time and capital. So zero economic profit just means that firms are earning a normal rate of return, just enough to keep them in business.
So they're covering all their costs,
Right.
including what they could be earning elsewhere. But they're not making any extra profit on top of that.
Exactly. And this long-run situation in perfect competition is actually really efficient. Consumers are getting the lowest possible price, and resources are being used in the best way possible.
Okay, so perfect competition is kind of like a best-case scenario
Yeah.
where everything works out nicely. Now, what about monopolies? They're like the opposite, right?
Yeah, monopolies are the only seller in town. They have all the power.
Okay, so the book defines a monopoly as a market with just one seller
Right.
making a product that has no close substitutes. So they can pretty much charge whatever they want.
Yeah, they have a lot of market power. The book uses figures 10.1 and 10.2 to show how a monopolist picks their price and output level.
So unlike in perfect competition,
Yeah,
the monopolist has to think about how much they can sell at different prices.
right.
If they raise the price too high, people won't buy it.
Exactly, and that's a key difference. For a monopolist, marginal revenue is less than the price.
Why is that?
Because to sell more, they have to lower the price for everyone, not just the new customers. So their total revenue doesn't go up as much when they sell more.
Okay, so they're still trying to find that sweet spot where marginal cost equals marginal revenue,
Right,
but their marginal revenue is lower than the price, so they end up producing less
right.
and charging a higher price compared to perfect competition.
Exactly. And that leads to what economists call deadweight loss,
Okay,
which means there are some potential gains from trade that are just lost.
so everyone is worse off,
Yeah,
both consumers and society as a whole.
pretty much. And monopolies can happen for different reasons. The book talks about Alcoa, which used to be basically the only aluminum producer in the U.S. for a long time. One reason was they had control over all the technology and patents.
Right, so patents, which are supposed to encourage innovation,
Yeah,
can sometimes end up creating temporary monopolies.
that's a good point. The book also talks about the costs of monopoly power and what the government can do about it. Antitrust laws try to prevent monopolies from forming,
Right.
and sometimes the government will regulate prices or output for natural monopolies, like utilities.
So there are ways to try to limit the downsides of monopolies. Okay, before we move on, I'm curious about monopsony.
Yeah,
It sounds like the opposite of a monopoly.
right.
Instead of one seller, it's one buyer.
Exactly. The textbook defines monopsony as a market with just one buyer. Imagine a small town where one company is the only employer. They have a lot of power to set wages.
Right, so just like a monopolist can control prices,
Uh-huh.
a monopsonist can control wages.
Yeah.
They might pay lower wages than in a competitive market.
Exactly. And that's obviously not good for workers.
Yeah.
It can lead to lower incomes and fewer job opportunities.
Okay, so monopolies and monopsonies are both examples of market power,
Right.
but on opposite sides of the market.
Exactly. And these situations show why the government sometimes needs to step in to protect consumers and workers.
Okay, cool. Now let's talk about something totally different. Time and capital markets. That's what Unit 6 is about, investment, time, and capital markets.
Yeah, this unit is all about how individuals and businesses make decisions about spending money now versus investing it for the future.
Sounds like financial planning.
Kinda. A key distinction here is between stocks and flows.
Oof, I remember that being confusing. Can you explain it again?
Of course. So capital, like machines, buildings, and equipment, is measured as a stock.
Okay.
It's a quantity at a specific point in time. Labor, on the other hand, is a flow, a quantity over a period of time.
So it's like the amount of water in a bathtub right now
Yeah,
versus the amount of water flowing into the bathtub every minute.
that's a great analogy. And investment is all about increasing the stock of capital, which then generates a flow of profits in the future.
Okay, so a company might buy a new machine today, even though it's expensive,
Uh-huh.
because they think it'll help them produce more and make more money in the long run.
Exactly. But how do they know if it's a good investment? That's where present discounted value, or PDV, comes in.
Okay, PDV, yeah, that sounds familiar. It's like saying money today is worth more than money tomorrow.
Exactly. Money has a time value because you could invest it today and earn interest. So to compare costs and benefits that happen at different times, we have to convert them to their present value.
Right, so the textbook gives a formula for PDV,
Yeah.
and it uses a discount rate to represent that opportunity cost of capital.
Exactly. The higher the discount rate, the less valuable future cash flows are.
Okay, so you basically need to figure out the present value of all the future benefits an investment will create,
Uh-huh.
and then compare that to the cost of the investment today.
Exactly. That's called the net present value, or NPD criterion. If the NPV is positive, meaning the present value of the benefits is bigger than the cost, then it's a good investment.
This is helpful for like everyone, not just
Mhm.
companies. Like if you're thinking about buying a house or going back to school.
Exactly. Those are investments too. The textbook uses the example of valuing a New York City taxi medallion
Oh yeah,
to show how these ideas work in real life.
those medallions used to be super valuable because you
Right.
needed one to operate a taxi, but then Uber and Lyft came along,
Yeah.
and the value of those medallions went way down.
Totally. It shows how technology and competition can change everything. The textbook explains how to use PDV to estimate the value of a medallion based on how much income you expect it to generate.
Wow, it's cool to see how these economic ideas can be used to analyze real-world stuff like that.
Yeah, it gives you a whole new way of thinking about investments and how markets work.
This whole deep dive has been so interesting. We've covered so much stuff,
Yeah, we have.
and I feel like I'm seeing the world in a new way now.
I'm glad. Hopefully, you're leaving with a better understanding of how the economy works.
Yeah, definitely. I'm seeing supply and demand and incentives and strategic decisions everywhere
Well,
now.
that's awesome. Economics is really all about understanding those forces that shape the world around us.
Well, this has been amazing. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. Keep learning, and until next time.